thank you for coming to the 12th and last session in this short course that Father Dwight Longeneck and I have been co-teaching, and we are culminating with The Lord of the Rings, which seems appropriate enough because it is it's been voted long before Peter Jackson came on the scene that the greatest work of the 20th century. It's also certainly the best-selling work of the 20th century globally. So what is it about that book? So that's what we're going to look at this evening, is unlocking The Lord of the Rings, and specifically unlocking the Catholic dimension of The Lord of the Rings. Okay, so Tolkien said, and I'm quoting him word for word here, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." Okay, so fundamentally religious and Catholic. Of course. Well, it's not of course for many people. Of course, there's no direct mention of the church or of Jesus Christ. The story itself takes place in this world. Tolkien says that Middle-earth is this earth, but thousands upon thousands of years before the birth of Christ. And very, very quickly on that, without going into too much detail, Chesterton's very good on this in The Everlasting Man, is that human history, there's two definitions of human history. One is the documented past, and the other is the past. And they're not the same thing. Right? The documented past is what we've actually got written records from, or archaeological records, something tangible we can measure, see, study. But of course, the further back in time you get, the vast majority of the past is not documented. Right, so it's like the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are by far the majority of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. So what Tolkien does, he takes that vacuum of missing pieces, because the oldest references to written text that we have refer to old civilizations that have come and gone, that we know nothing about. So basically, tens of thousands of years before 5,000 years ago, there were civilizations which we basically know nothing about. So Tolkien's basically taking that empty space, the missing piece of the puzzle, and putting his imagination there and making a story. But because it's millennia before the birth of Christ, obviously there can be no direct reference to religion. So how do we detect the fundamentally Catholic nature of the Lord of the Rings? Well, you remember from our first session about Tolkien's lecture on fairy stories, that the mystical towards the supernatural, the magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards man, that good fairy stories show us ourselves. So we're going to look at what sort of person is shown to us in The Lord of the Rings. I would normally, if giving a talk on The Lord of the Rings, talk about what sort of cosmos is it. Well, I've already said it's our cosmos, but we have in the Silmarillion, which we discussed last week, the creation story, the one God who creates the great music and asks the archangels to play, and by extension asks us to play, but we can choose, or we can choose to refuse, as Melkor does. And there's the fall, first of all, of Satan, of Melkor. Sauron is his greatest servant, the Dark Lord, and the Lord of the Rings. Okay, so we have Iluvatar, the All-Father, the Father of all God. We have Melkor, we have Satan. They're off camera, not absent. Certainly God is not absent, as we shall see. But Sauron, the Dark Lord at the dark centre of the Lord of the Rings, if you like, is described in the Silmarillion as the greatest of Melkor's servants. So the greatest servant of Satan is Sauron, the Dark Lord, and he is himself a demon. So the evil power in the Lord of the Rings is demonic. And we see this played out linguistically as well. We need to remember that Tolkien's a linguist, a philologist at Oxford University, so he gives us clues in language. So one of the wicked characters in The Lord of the Rings is Wormtongue. And Wormtongue, the old English word for dragon or serpent, was worm, W-Y-R-M. So Wormtongue means dragon tongue or serpent tongue. And we actually see the scene in The Lord of the Rings where Gandalf says to Theoden, "See, Theoden, here is a snake," pointing towards Wormtongue. And then Gandalf says, "Down on your belly, snake." Again, reflecting God and Satan and Genesis, the Garden of Eden. And then when he says, "Down your belly, snake," Wormtongue hisses his reply. So the symbolism there of the satanic being linked to the serpent. Of course, in iconography, we see paintings of St. Michael. He's slaying a dragon or a serpent. That, of course, is Satan being depicted in that form, or St. George and the dragon. Okay, so what sort of man, and I think we discussed last week, we discussed last week Homo economicus? Yeah, good. Nodding means that people are at least listening. And then Homo sapiens. So they're the types of men that you won't see in Middle-earth because they're modern understandings of humanity which do not find their way into Tolkien's stories. What you will find is Homo viator, man on a journey, man on a pilgrimage, Homo superbus, proud man, the man who refuses the journey or goes his own way, and then anthropos, he who looks up in wonder. So let's look at that. First of all, both in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, of course, the journey is the central part of the story, the quest. Spiritually, the pilgrimage. We saw out in The Hobbit last week. I'll take questions at the end, Jonathan, if I can, okay? But just remember it, and I'll take it then. Otherwise, I'll get sidetracked and I won't cover the bases. That Homo viator is spiritually the journey is a pilgrimage. We saw in The Hobbit how Bilbo Baggins had to go on the journey to get out of his comfort zone, to embrace suffering, and he dies to himself and is resurrected in the process. So the same sort of thing we see in The Lord of the Rings with the journey that Frodo Baggins and the Fellowship take. Anthropos, in one of the darkest moments in the story, Samwise Gamgee looks up and says or sings a song which has the line, "Above all shadows rides the sun." So we see the same motif in The Hobbit with the image of the sun and the moon, that light coming down, signifying supernatural power. So what there, it looks like the evil is all powerful. It can't be defeated. It's too strong. And those who are trying to fight for the good are too weak and too few. It seems futile. And Sam is enclosed by this sense of desolation, verging on despair. And yet he looks up and in the edge of Mordor, and there's an inkling, even in that dark land, that above all the shadow, above all the evil, the sun is still shining. So above all darkness is the light. And of course, symbolically, above all evil, there is a transcendent, supernatural, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient God. And doing his will is what's needed against all odds. All right, but before we get any further, talking about who represents us and Christ figures, I want to give you the one piece of information that unlocks the Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings. And one of you is going to know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask. Probably 70 of you know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask. On what date was the ring destroyed? March the 25th, okay. Now, I've given talks. So if I'm giving talks at a Catholic venue, the title of the talk on the Lord of the Rings is The Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings. Let's have it out there. But if I'm speaking at a non-Catholic or a non-Christian venue, it's just unlocking the Lord of the Rings, a bit more coy, right? A bit more subtle. So I've given talks, for instance, at Princeton and at Harvard and at Columbia University and various state universities. And so you say, what date was the ring destroyed? And I say, March the 25th, and you get a whole hall of blank faces. March the 25th. So what's so special about March the 25th? So you have to give them a clue. What happens 9 months after March the 25th? April, May, June, July. Santa Claus comes down the chimney. Now, even in Harvard, they know that 9 months after March 25th is December the 25th, which is the nativity of our Lord, right, the birth of Christ. And they do understand the facts of life at those places. So what happens 9 months before that, right? And then you can say that because human life begins at conception, not at birth, that March the 25th is a much more important date than December the 25th. Because it's on March the 25th that God becomes man. It's March the 25th when the Word becomes flesh. It's March the 25th when we have the Feast of the Incarnation. So this is a very, very important date. This is the date on which the ring is destroyed. Now, we should be having our sort of, again, you have to learn, if you want to enjoy literature, we talked about this when we looked at Brideshead, you have to learn to read literarily and not literally, okay? So you have to learn, have your antennae twitching for symbols, signs, metaphors, things that will take you deeper. So when you see the date March the 25th, you should think, oh, hold on for a second, that's obviously a significant date. And then when you realise that Tolkien is a medievalist, steeped in medieval culture, and he would know that traditionally March the 25th is also considered to be the historical date of the crucifixion. Now, we don't ascribe a date to the crucifixion because liturgically the Easter Triduum falls on a different date each year, right? So it's not one specific date for Good Friday, but historically Christ was crucified on one particular specific date. And according to the early church and the medieval church, that was March the 25th. So now you have this date, which is already hugely significant as the date on which the Word becomes flesh. It's also the date on which the Word which becomes flesh lays down his life and dies for us. When you put those two things together, we talked about the most significant date in human history, the most significant date in Christian theology, the most significant date in the liturgical year. This is the date on which the ring is destroyed. This should set us thinking. What does that mean? Well, we then think laterally. What is destroyed on March the 25th? Not in the story, but beyond the story. What Christ does in his life, death, and resurrection is to destroy the power of sin, to redeem us. What is original sin? The one sin to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. And the one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them, and the one sin to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them, are both destroyed on the same significant date. When you understand that, you can start to make sense of the whole of the rest of the Lord of the Rings. Because if the ring is destroyed at the same date and the sin is destroyed, it means that the ring is synonymous with sin. So when we put the ring on, it's the act of sin. The act of sin means we excommunicate ourselves from the good world that God made. We become invisible from it. But we become more visible than ever to Sauron, because we've entered his domain, his dominion. The longer we keep the ring on, the more we fall under his power. The more we don't want to take it off, the more we become addicted to it. And if we allow that to happen, we do Gollumize ourselves. We become like Gollum. And I really, you might talk about this being a fantasy novel, but I do not know of any depiction anywhere in literature which for me is as realistic of a depiction of a human soul completely addicted to mortal sin than Gollum. We're no longer the good hobbit that God made us to be. We become a shriveled, shrunken wreck of who we're meant to be, that want nothing but our precious sin. Nothing else matters but our precious sin. Okay, so we now see the power of the ring if we choose to wear it. What about if we choose not to wear it, but to bear it? What if we choose, instead of wearing the ring, to bear the ring? What if we choose to carry it, but not wear it? Now we're carrying the weight of sin without sinning. We're carrying the burden voluntarily without sinning. Now the ring becomes the cross. Frodo Baggins, insofar as he's the ring bearer, is a cross bearer. And again, Tolkien gives us another clue. He's very subtle. On what date, it's much more difficult, but you might know it. On what date do the Fellowship of the Ring leave Rivendell? December the 25th. All right, so actually in the Lord of the Rings, in the text of Lord of the Rings, we are told it's March the 25th. In the text of Lord of the Rings, we're only told that it is late December. But in the appendix, we're told it's December the 25th. So you have to do a bit of digging to get this information. But what it does mean, of course, is that the journey of Frodo Baggins from Rivendell to Mount Doom is the life of Christ from his birth to his death. Mount Doom being Golgotha, right? And that's a perfect name for Golgotha, by the way, Mount Doom. That's exactly what Mount Golgotha was Mount Doom. All right, so now we're really getting ourselves into the metaphysical, theological depths, to begin to see now why the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. Let's look at some Christ figures. The most obvious Christ figure, of course, as we've just discussed, is Frodo. Insofar as Frodo Baggins is the ring bearer, he's the cross bearer. He leaves Rivendell on Christmas Day, he arrives at Mount Doom on Good Friday, bearing the burden of sin for the whole of Middle-earth. But we have to get something very clear here, though. Tolkien is much, much more subtle than most allegorists. So, for instance, in the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan is always a figure of the Son of God at all times in all 7 stories. That's who he is. He's how God the Son appears in Narnia. Lewis says that Narnia is a supposal. It's a word he, as far as I know, he's invented in literary terms. A supposal. Let's suppose there are other worlds that God has made where he has created creatures in his own image that have the same faculties of being able to love, reason, create that we have. And what about if one of these worlds, these Imago Dei creatures, took the form of talking beasts, rational beasts? How might God the Son become visible to them? Well, perhaps he would be the king of the beasts. Of course, this is all connected to biblical imagery. Now, Christ is the Lamb, but he's also the Lion of Judah, right? He's a king in majesty to be feared, as well as someone who meekly lays down his life for others, the shepherd, the sheep, the lamb. The subtlety. Frodo Baggins is a hobbit of the Shire, literally, right? He's not a depiction of Christ. He's a hobbit of the Shire. You have to do with the Lord of the Rings what you do with the Bible. You have the literal meaning, and then you have various levels of allegorical meaning. What's signified by this? So insofar as Frodo is the ring bearer, he's a cross bearer. Insofar as he's a cross bearer, he's a Christ figure. But the rest of the time, he's just a hobbit. And in another sense, all of the hobbits, including Frodo, are everyman figures. The hobbits are small. It's the exaltation of the humble, of the man or the hobbit next door, not the great and powerful, but the small and meek, the ordinary person, and what the ordinary person is called to do. So the hobbits, in some sense, are everyman figures. They represent us. We are also meant to take the journey. It's homo viator. Go on the quest for heaven. It's the purpose of life. But he's a Christ figure. Now, there are other Christ figures in the Lord of the Rings. Gandalf lays down his life, his friends, fighting a demon. The Balrog is a demon. We know that from the Silmarillion. And he dies. And he does die. And if it's not spoiled for you by an older sibling or something, you really believe when you're first reading it or watching it, if you came to the stories that way, that Gandalf is dead. And he is dead. And for a few hundred pages, everybody thinks he's dead. And then in the woods, we see Gandalf again. But now he's wearing a robe. He's no longer Gandalf the Grey. He's Gandalf the White, because his robe is resplendent, so dazzling that you can't even look directly at it. It's like looking at the sun. So Gandalf has to put his grey cloak over the white cloak, and it's like the sun going in so that they can look at him. So here we have with Gandalf death, resurrection, transfiguration. So in this capacity, these aspects of who he is, Gandalf's also a Christ figure, while of course not being a literal Christ figure in the same way that Aslan is. And the other one is Aragorn. Aragorn is the depiction of Christ the King. It's in his aspect as the true king that his Christ-likeness emerges. So before I go that far, did I talk? I don't know who I've spoken to and about what. I'm sorry, my life is a complete confusion. Did we talk about the Jacobite last week? Because I did mention it briefly because about the motif of the return of the king in The Hobbit, okay? So again, for English imagination, King Arthur is the once and future king. So this idea of waiting for the return of the king is the Arthurian, the once and future king who will return. Also the Jacobite, the true Catholic king who's forced into exile in 1688. And then his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, leads an army trying to get the crown back in 1745. And that ultimately fails. So, but then Jacobites, from the Latin word for James, Jacobus, that's where they get the name from. They always toast the king over the water. Did I talk about that? Oh, we've got to do this because this is very useful. You know, if you live in Greenville, South Carolina, sooner or later you're going to be at a very posh dinner where you're going to toast His Majesty the King. It's bound to happen, right? It happens all the time. So when you find yourself in that situation, which is just a matter of time, right? You'll be asked to stand to toast His Majesty the King. And you will have on your table, if you're a civilized person, a water glass. And you have also a glass of wine. And you lift up your glass of wine. And they said the toast is His Majesty the King. And you say, His Majesty the King, and you pass your wine glass over the water. And you toast the true king and awaiting his return rather than the impostor on the throne. Now, it gets more complicated than that. Queen Elizabeth II was very intent on saying she's descended from Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. In other words, she's actually related to the true kings and queens. So I don't get often all this genealogy, but Queen Elizabeth II was sensitive to the fact that she's not an imposter. But if you're a Jacobite, the royal family that took over, what's first wasn't a royal family, it was a revolution. You know, imagine the most treacherous thing you can imagine is paying for an army of foreign mercenaries to invade your own country. That's what it was, 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution. As a Catholic king on the throne, they would not tolerate a Catholic king, so they paid a foreign army to invade their own country to remove the king. So that's the scenario we have here. In that case, when you've got these usurpers coming over, their heirs are not the true king, they're stewards, just like the stewards of Gondor. They're keeping the throne warm until the true king returns. All right, so this idea of the once and future king, the return of the king, and of course, all of us as Christians are awaiting the return of the king, Christ the King, at the consummation of things. So all of us are in that position. So we can see here that Aragorn, as the true king, is not just an Arthurian figure, though he is, not just a Jacobite figure, though he is, he's also a figure of Christ the King. And we see this played out specifically within the story. For instance, it's said by the wise woman of Gondor that the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. That one way that we will know the true king when he returns, he will be able to heal the sick. And of course, he can, and he does. Incidentally, by the way, only Tolkien can make a weed, you know, a useless flower that people want to pay landscapers to mow out of their ground. Only Tolkien can make a weed a Christ figure. Because in The Lord of the Rings, there is a plant called king's foil. King's foil means king's leaf. And everyone thinks it's useless, it has no use, it's just a weed, get rid of it. But this humble flower, like God becoming a baby, this humble flower, the exaltation of the humble, recurring motif, Sauron does not know where the ring is because the proud do not expect anything of value to be in the hands of the meek, the unknown, the powerless, the small. So he's not even looking at the Shire. This exaltation of the humble. So this humble flower, it's useless. In the hands of the true king, king's foil is the means by which the king administers healing. So you've got, even a flower, and there's another Christ figure we'll come to as well in a moment. But it's also said of the true king that he could take the paths of the dead and survive. If anybody, any man, any mere mortal takes the paths of the dead, they die. No one emerges alive from this valley of the cursed dead. But it's said that the true king can take the paths of the dead and survive. So Aragorn takes the paths of the dead. He does not only survive, we see that he has power to release the dead themselves of their curse. They're liberated from the curse of death itself. And this, of course, has to remind us Christ descending into hell following the crucifixion and liberating the souls in limbo. So we see Christ figures in terms of Frodo, Baggins, Gandalf, and Aragorn. And I mentioned Kingsfoil. But also there's another Christ figure. Come on then, see if anyone can come up with the other Christ figure. No, all right, good, that's good. Sam is a loyal disciple because if he's following Frodo, he can't really be a Christ figure, but he might be the perfect apostle. Yeah, he's the perfect. Well, that's true. That's true. I mean, I'm not going to argue with that, but to me, he's the perfect disciple. If Frodo's the Christ figure, Sam is the perfect disciple. But you certainly can argue that Sam is the real hero of the story, because if it's about the exaltation of the humble, right? Okay, so I'm going to say that Sam's not the answer I was looking for. Put it that way. I'm not saying anybody's wrong. It's not the answer I was looking for. No, I'm not, but we can talk about Tom Bombadil probably in the questions if you want. I won't have time in the thing. There's a chapter in my book, Frodo's Journey, first commercial break. In my book, Frodo's Journey, the Enigma of Tom Bombadil. So there's a whole chapter on him. Theoden. No, I like that. I mean, I see a connection between Theoden, of God, Theo, Greek for God, right? Theoden of God, and Deneth Thor, right? So he's the sort of Thor, so he's the pagan who despairs and commits suicide. But I'm saying that's not the answer I'm looking for. Wait, I'm not expecting you to get it. No, not Boromir. See, because probably you've got to think laterally now. Think laterally. So I've already said that a weed might be a Christ figure in some sense. So try to think outside of personalities. Not Gandalf. Well, he is a Christ. We already discussed him. Ian. Not Eowyn. Not the elves. All right, I'll put you out of your misery. Do you remember the quote I read, I think, at the end of the first session? Remember the quote I read? Well, it just so happens I have it in front of me here. I was going to finish with it, but we won't finish with it now. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the blessed sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth, and more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. That's Tolkien's love for the Blessed Sacrament, but it's also a clue. Right, okay, lembas. All right, lembas. Tolkien gives us clues linguistically. It's not often that he makes a point of telling us what a word in Elvish means. If he does tell us that, we should probably pay attention. So he tells us that lembas, there's two different Elvish languages, and in one of the languages it means way bread, and the other it means life bread or bread of life. Now, first of all, even way bread is Eucharistic, because when you give the Blessed Sacrament to someone in extremis on their deathbed, it's viaticum, right? Via, as in journey. It's food for the journey, way bread. But the other one, of course, the bread of life. Lembas means the bread of life. And we're told in the Lord of the Rings, it doesn't so much feed the body as feed the will. That's what it feeds. So in Mordor, it's all they have to live on, is the bread of life, lembas. By the way, in my book, Frodo's Journey, I talk about when Tolkien's writing Lord of the Rings, there's a Eucharistic miracle with a woman, I think in Spain, and she's in a hospital, and there's all sorts of medical tests. She has no nutrition whatsoever. She eats nothing, has no food whatsoever, but she receives the Eucharistic host, and there's no sign of any bodily decay. She's in great health, and this is after 30, 40 days. And it's completely baffling everybody. This is going on at the time. I don't know if Tolkien knew about that, but he would certainly have known about older Eucharistic miracles. And we saw what he thinks about the Blessed Sacrament. We just read it. Okay, so we even see how lembas is a Christ figure, right? The real presence of Christ in food that feeds the will. All right, so they're the Christ figures. I'd like to probably conclude with looking at everyman figures. And we've already discussed how the hobbits are everyman figures, those who represent us. Remember, a large facet of good fairy stories, they hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. Got to remember not to keep wandering off camera, haven't I, really? Okay. I like to walk, but I'll keep myself stationary here. So the hobbits are everyman figures. Sam is the perfect Christian, if you like. If Frodo's the Christ figure, Sam's the perfect Christian. But all the hobbits are everyman figures. They're what we're called to do. Take up our cross, go on the appointed quest for heaven, defeat dragons by the help of God. But there are, I would suggest, 3 other key everyman figures that aren't hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. Anyone want to tell me who they might be? Boromir. Okay, well done. That's the best answer. Now, the reason I say it's the best answer is because Tolkien tells us that in the text, basically, of the work, just because of circumstance. So the Fellowship of the Ring. What constitutes the Fellowship of the Ring? There's 4 hobbits. There's a wizard. There's a king. And then there is representatives of the dwarves. There's representatives of the elves, 1 representative for the dwarves, 1 representative for the elves, and 1 representative of men. Our official representative, representing the whole of humanity in the Fellowship of the Ring, is the only man in the Fellowship, Boromir. Now, that's a bit of a sobering thought, because Boromir is the traitor. Boromir is the one who betrays the Fellowship. Boromir is the one who tries to take the ring by force from Frodo. That doesn't sound very good, does it? It's not. We're not being seen in a good light here. But he also dies laying down his life for his friends. No greater love has any man, says our Lord, than to lay down his life for his friends. Boromir dies heroically. And then better than that, his final scene with Aragorn follows the form of the sacrament of confession, that Boromir is sorry, he's a penitent, he confesses what he's done, and he says, I have failed. And Aragorn says, no, you have won a great victory. He's absolved. Aragorn here, in persona Christi, as every priest is in the sacrament of penance, in the person of Christ. It's not the power of the priest that absolves the sinner, it's the power of Christ that absolves the sinner. So Aragorn here, in persona Christi, hears Boromir's final confession, absolves him from his sin. What's the last act of Boromir before he dies? Again, hugely significant. He smiles. He smiles. Again, that speaks 1,000 words. He succeeded. He hasn't failed. So, it's not so bad now, Boromir, right? So he's a bit like a Mary Magdalene figure. He sort of goes wrong, but then gets it right in the end, okay? He's going to heaven. And it gets better than that. Because Tolkien then gives us another everyman figure in Faramir. And again, you have to learn to read literarily. Faramir is not just another man. He's Boromir's brother. He's also our representative. By the way, if you've only seen the Peter Jackson movies, Peter Jackson completely ruins Faramir. So if that's all you've seen, then you've got the wrong picture of Faramir in your head. You need to go and read the book. But in The Lord of the Rings, we are told that Faramir says, I would not pick up the ring if I saw it lying in the side of the road. He also says, I would not snare even an orc with a falsehood. Not the smallest lie to the devil himself. So Tolkien gives us Boromir, the repentant sinner, and Faramir, quite frankly, the saint, as Everyman figures. And now, if anything, we begin to think, well, surely that's a bit more than we deserve, right? You're holding up a mirror to man. That's not really a true picture, especially as Tolkien says in the essay on fairy stories, holding up a mirror of scorn and pity to man. So who's the Everyman figure that holds up a mirror of scorn and pity to man in The Lord of the Rings? Gollum. Gollum. We discussed that already, how we Gollumize ourselves, we become possessed by our possessions, the dragon sickness in The Hobbit, the power of the ring becoming possessive. We become possessed by the possessions. All right, so we see that's what we can become like Gollum. If we refuse to be Homo viator and we choose to become Homo superbus, we will become Gollum. Everyman figures, Christ figures. We covered most of it now. I just want to conclude. The most brilliant part of the Lord of the Rings is the part of the Lord of the Rings which infuriates me, first time I read it, and infuriates most people first time I read it. It connects, by the way, to Beowulf. I'm going to resist another commercial break. But if you know something about Beowulf, it's a Christian allegory. Tolkien knew that poem very well. He translated it from Old English into modern English. There are parallels between both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and Beowulf, but I'm not going to go off on that tangent. But it's very, very apropos what I'm about to say here, because this is the same thing happens in Beowulf, in some sense. So, we follow Frodo Baggins at walking pace most of the time for about 1,000 pages, right? We've been patient, we've been exhausted, we carry on the journey. And then finally he gets to the easiest part. Got to the top of Mount Doom. They've walked through Mordor. They've faced all sorts of perils. Now all he has to do, I'm going to demonstrate. Ready? It's easy. Better pick that up again, because if I look to lose that, I'd be in big trouble. He's done the hard work. That's all he needs to do. And we're invested. 1,000 pages worth of investment, in fact. And he doesn't do it. He refuses. The Homo viator chooses to be Homo superbus at the crucial moment. And we think, Frodo, you miserable loser. How dare you drag me for 1,000 pages for this anticlimax? And then you have your first epiphany in literary criticism. Because you realize it's not poor Frodo's fault. Tolkien made him do it. You think, Tolkien, you miserable loser, how dare you drag us and Frodo for 1,000 pages for this? And then at some point you think, well, you know, Tolkien's not an idiot, and the rest of the story's great, there has to be some reason for this. And then it all falls into place. At the beginning of the story, Frodo Baggins says, I wish Uncle Bilbo had destroyed that miserable creature. It's a pity that he didn't. And Gandalf responds, pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Then later in the story, Frodo has the opportunity to have Gollum killed at the Forbidden Pool. And he says, now I do see him, I do forgive him. I do pity him. Now I see him, I do pity him. Later in the story, Sam also has the opportunity to kill Gollum and stays his hand. The most difficult commandment that our Lord gives us is to love our enemy. Loving our neighbour is hard enough. I think as Chesterton says that the reason loving our neighbour is so difficult is that loving our neighbour and loving our enemy is normally the same thing. But loving our enemy is not easy. But if any of those 3 hobbits had failed in that commandment to love their enemy, Gollum would not have been there. And Frodo would not have been delivered from his own pride by a miserable sinner, providentially, who's still there because of their virtue. So God in his providence has provided the salvation that's not within Frodo's power. The large part of Beowulf, the first 2 parts of Beowulf, is against the Pelagian heresy. The Pelagian heresy was a do-it-yourself religion, a self-help. You can get to heaven by the power of your own will. Just listen to what Jesus said and do it, you'll get to heaven. It's all about you and your will. Of course, that's the case. You don't need grace. You don't need supernatural assistance. You do it yourself. If you don't need grace, you don't need sacraments. If you don't need sacraments, you don't need church. It's just you doing what Jesus says. This Pelagian heresy was huge. And Beowulf's about that. I'm not going to go off on that tangent, as I said. But the same thing here. This lesson. Frodo does not have the power to destroy the ring because the ring is more powerful than he is. Sin is more powerful than the sinner. And without divine help, without divine intervention, without that supernatural help which theologians call grace, we cannot prevail. So Gollum, paradoxically and ironically, is an agent of grace. God can and does bring good out of evil. There's messages throughout the whole of history echoing that. All right, I'm going to finish on a more whimsical note. I said when Tolkien gives you the Elvish etymological definition, pay attention. He does it with Lembas. We've talked about that. But also the Palantir stones, the Palantiri. And what are they, right? These crystals, balls. When you look into them, you only see what the dominant will that controls them wants you to see. It might not necessarily be a complete lie, but it's going to be a very one-sided version of things. So Denethor spends too much time looking in the Palantir stone, being fed propaganda by Sauron, the dominant will who controls the stones, becomes completely convinced that fighting the power of evil is a waste of time because it's too powerful, gives up the fight and commits suicide. He despairs. What does Palantir mean in Elvish? Far-seeing. Okay, who speaks German? Ian's sort of waving his hand. That looks a bit like a royal wave, like Queen Elizabeth II there. The German word for television is Fernsehen, which means far-seeing. You might think that's a bit obscure, but what's the English word for television? Television. Well done. But etymologically, what does television mean? Tele is the Greek for far. Vision from the Latin video, to see, or videre, video. So Palantir in Elvish means television. Tolkien was horrified by the way that the radio was used during World War II by all sides to tell lies. The one thing you were not getting was the truth, you were getting propaganda. Television was the new technology. And Tolkien's writing The Lord of the Rings, it's out there, it's new, and he could see the power of the machine. It's a whole other aspect of Lord of the Rings, the magical aspect of one of those M's we haven't even talked about, the power of the machine to dominate and enslave. So as the moral of the message there, of course, the Denethor lesson is do not spend too much time watching TV or you'll commit suicide. And it also applies to other devices, handheld and otherwise. And on that note, I was going to end up with a quote of the Blessed Sacrament, but we had that halfway through. So I'm going to end there. Good timing. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, and obviously there's loads of things about the Lord of the Rings that's impossible to cover in 45 or 50 minutes. So I'm assuming there will be some questions. Yes, what I would say, okay, this is going to, how to answer this sort of, briefly, that we have to be careful, right? So some things you can prove and show and demonstrate, all right? And they're the things that have real authority. March the 25th is an absolute authority, right? Mithril coat and the power of elvish craft as a sacramental, as the armour of God, I think is a bit more speculative and a bit more of a stretch. And it's not necessarily a problem as long as we've got this hierarchy of authenticity in our minds, and we know when something is objectively showable or something is subjectively desirable or something I can take from it. As long as we know the difference, Yes, but there is this hierarchy, and I think it's very important to keep it clear. Otherwise, we make all sorts of wacky claims about it, and it just becomes a mess as regards coherence and cohesiveness. I'm not repeating the questions. Mea culpa, maxima culpa. I will improve. The last one was about whether we can see things such as mithril coats as sacramentals. Yeah. Does Mary, the Mother of God, appear in The Lord of the Rings? Great question. Marian figures in The Lord of the Rings? Yes. So, first of all, Tolkien says in one of his letters he put all of his love for the Blessed Virgin Mary into the characterization of Galadriel. So, and one thing I did very much like about the Peter Jackson extended version of, I think, The Two Towers, I get confused, when they're leaving Lothlorien for the last time and they look back, they're in the boat, they look back and you've got Galadriel standing on the shore, and clearly Jackson has deliberately made her look like an icon of the Blessed Virgin, either Our Lady of Fatima or Our Lady of Lourdes, sort of a glow around her head and this white robe and sort of this bathed in light. So absolutely we have that. And the other Marian figure is Eowyn. So Eowyn is a bit disobedient, a bit prideful. She learns her lessons. That's her own journey, right? She's a Homo Viator. The Witch King of Angmar, right? The King of the Nazgul says to her in the battlefield, "Do you not know that no man can kill me?" She takes her helmet off and she says, "I am no man." And it's the woman that slays the dragon. And again, from Christian iconography, that's the woman crushing the head of the serpent. So in Eowyn, we also see an image of the Marian. Referenced in The Lord of the Rings are not Iluvatar. Well, Morgoth is hardly recognised either. It's Sauron, so he's sort of one step removed. So Morgoth is very much playing an off-stage role. Correct. The Morgoth, the Satan figure, as opposed to Sauron, the greatest Sauron servants, is off stage in the Lord of the Rings. He's referenced in terms of the Balrog by Galadriel, but he's off stage. But why is the satanic? Because Sauron is certainly mentioned an awful lot, and God is not mentioned at all. Now, Tolkien says that the religious dimension is subsumed within the story. And you have to think, put yourself in Tolkien's position. He's a Catholic. He can't bring Christ into the story except in the ways we've shown he has done, right? With this great subtle allegorical way. It can't be overt. If he's going to bring religious practice in, it's got to be pagan. How can it be anything else? He doesn't want to bring pagan religious practice in. So it's left out. So all formal religious practice is left out. So there's the one beautiful moment when Faramir and his men stand and face the west, which is the mystic west, very symbolic of heaven in Lord of the Rings, in a moment's silence, which we can take to be prayer. There's obviously some symbol in that silence, but he has to keep it out in order to keep the wrong sort of religion out, because he can't bring the right sort in except by subsuming it within the story, which he does in the manner in which we've said. That's a great question. So basically, Tolkien writes The Hobbit for his own children initially. So it's a children's book, and it's hugely successful. So the publisher is keen that he writes a follow-up children's book. And so he sets out to do that. And I would even argue that even though with the revisions and everything else he does, I would even argue that until we get to Mirkwood, until Old Man Willow and that sort of thing, it really is, you can see how it can be seen as a follow-up to The Hobbit, but then it sort of grows up, grows out, grows dark, and it's no longer a children's book. So then, one thing I find very charming about the writing of The Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien was writing it in the end, not believing it was publishable. So it's absolutely not a mercenary motive anymore, because he's not trying anymore to write the book that his publisher wanted. He's writing something that's never really been done before, sort of a prose epic about a strange world. I mean, it's not been done. Who's going to want to publish this? And he actually, he says of his friendship with C.S. Lewis, he says that Lewis's influence was not in the usual understanding of the word, but Lewis was the great encourager And if it wasn't for Lewis's encouragement, he might not have finished The Lord of the Rings. Because at this point, where's this going, and no one's going to publish it, which I find charming, because, he's not trying to do it for money or for fame. He's doing it to bring a work of beauty, magisterial splendor into being, using the gifts that God's given him. That's a great, great question, and a difficult one to answer in 2 minutes, but I'll do my best. Tolkien said, when someone wrote to him, is The Lord of the Rings an allegory of power? An allegory of atomic power? He said no, but it is an allegory of power, particularly power usurped for domination. But he then said, but more than that, it's an allegory of death and immortality. So what the elves show here, the alchemists, so magic, right? This desire for power to dominate over nature and over men, to have godlike powers. The alchemists were seeking the elixir of life, immortality. They were seeking the philosopher's stone, how to turn base metal into gold to become very rich, to become very rich and live forever. This is the magic that's demonic, that's inspiring Tolkien. So what he shows with the elves, what happened if we got the elixir of life? What if we actually got it? What if we did live forever? Not eternal life with God in heaven, happily ever after, but for thousands and thousands of years in this vale of tears and this land of exile, whereas Galadriel says that she and her husband Celeborn have fought the long defeat for ages of this world. Doesn't matter how many times you fight evil, how many times you defeat evil, it comes back like a fungus. And Tolkien says, as a Christian, I see history as the long defeat with only occasional glimpses of final victory. So the elves are trapped for millennia in this vale of tears, in this land of exile. So that's what Tolkien is showing. Okay, well, and then, so what do they say? So what do the elves say about men's mortality? In the Silmarillion, they call death is the gift of Ilúvatar to man. Death is God's gift to man. Now that's counterintuitive, because in some sense it is a punishment, right? We forfeit the life people should have had through sin. But the point is that we are able to leave this fallen, broken world and to be with God for eternity. And in that sense, death is a liberation. If we're in a state of grace when we die, death is a moment of liberation. Dwarves. Well, yeah, dwarves. Okay, so the first thing I want to say about this is we have to resist the temptation to think that Tolkien has a one-on-one allegorical connection to everything in the story. He doesn't. There's a very interesting story about the dwarves, which I will tell very quickly. It's in the Silmarillion. Basically, the archangel, is it Aule? I always get them mixed up. Aule, the archangel, he wants to create beings in his own image. So not just animals, not just beasts, but rational beings. And so he does so. He brings the race of dwarfs into being as an act of subcreation, not brought into being ex nihilo by God. And then God confronts him about it. And what are you doing? And immediately Aule repents and says, I'm sorry, and picks up a hammer to destroy his own creatures as an act of obedience to God. And when he does that, at that moment, the dwarves react with free will. God blesses the creation of the dwarves by bestowing upon them freedom of the will, which Aule could not do. All he could do was make sort of robotic creatures that would do his will. These creatures now have free will, and then basically God says to him, okay, well, you don't have to destroy them, but put your toys away until I tell you can bring them out. And that's the dwarves are actually created in that way. So we could talk a lot about what that says about Tolkien's theology of creativity. We don't have time, but it's very, very intriguing. So it's published in 3 volumes. I think, first of all, I always get these dates mixed up. I think 1951. Does someone want to contradict me? I think between the 51 and 53, they were published originally in the 3 separate volumes before the single volume came out in the mid-50s.
Okay. If you know. Is there any history of that?
You mean that the Lambeth Council, where the Church of England basically sells out to the spirit of the age? Yeah. Tolkien's faith was much stronger than that. I don't think, and he was never Anglican and never thought much of the Anglicans. I don't think anything that happened at the Lambeth Conference would have, Tolkien's Catholic faith preceded it and superseded it.
Would it have?
I don't know, and I'm not sure.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, I don't know. I mean, there's now an expanded volume of his letters. We could probably fairly easily look up from around the time of Lambeth Council and see what he says about it. But he considered his mother to be a martyr for the Catholic faith. And she was persecuted by members of the family who were Anglicans. And he does not have much time for the Anglican Church. So I don't think necessarily that he would have been as surprised as we might think he would. He might have even have sort of said, well, that figures. Yeah, I don't know, but knowing what I know about Tolkien's view ecclesially, when he's just a devout Catholic and was very steeped in the history of England, and the Anglican Church is a state religion which persecuted England's Catholics, that's where he's coming from. So he has no sympathy for the Anglican Church. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Please continue to be part of the Rosary College story.